Uh-huh. No, I don't. No, it's the chances it's done. Don't worry about it. It's done. The fuck? Why is my name there? What the fuck? Hold on. What the hell? No, bitch. You. What the hell? I'm supposed to be pinned. What are you doing? What the fuck? Nah, bro. That's supposed to be my name. Why is it my name? Oh.
Now, fellas.
Hi everybody. I have a single sheet of paper that I want everyone to have. I think the safest way to do it is I'm going to put it somewhere, and then one at a time, or a family at a time, kind of get it rather than me come over to you and hand it out, which is what I'd like to do, but I just don't think that's the right way to handle it. So I'm going to put it on a chair in front and instruct people to take when they come in, and then come over one family at a time to pick up.
It's spectacular.
Can't hear you.
Microphone.
Gentle, everyone. Trying something new. Circumstances are inviting us to be creative and inventive in our experience of spirituality this year. And in addition to the traditional Musafs that already happened here on the field and the one that's happening on 2 different Zooms, we're going to enter into a Musaf mode, some of the themes that are present in the Yom Kippur Musaf. But through the vehicle of quiet meditation, some guided, some silent, some short little bursts of Torah wisdom related to the themes, and some nigun. And we'll see how it goes. I'm delighted that you're here, those of you who are here in person. I'm delighted those who are here on live stream and Zoom. Meditation is such it's both a very private experience, but it can be intimate when you're doing it with others. And so my instincts, as I've been saying throughout this time, would be to be in a tight circle with you. Literally feel each other's breath and bodies and the proximity. And that we can't have. But we can create an intimacy by knowing that each of us are entering into a deep meditative place. We try to access things in our consciousness that are often obscured. The nigun that I started with is referred to by some at least as the Piazetzner nigun. It's not been proven, but most people associate it as having been composed by the Piazetzner Rabbi, by Kalanimus Kalman Shapiro. who was the Rabbi of the town of Piazetz, and then was incarcerated in the Warsaw Ghetto, and then essentially became the Rabbi of the Warsaw Ghetto, if you can believe that task, before he was murdered by the Nazis. And a lot of his writings persist, and some of his music persists. And so the reason I wanted to start with the Piazetz Nigun is because I wanted to start the meditation based on a teaching by the Piazetz Rabbi. This is from a sermon he gave on Rosh Hashanah in 1939. Just imagine the world, imagine Poland in 1939, September or October. And even if they didn't know exactly what was about to happen, the writing was certainly on the wall. And he wrote these words for Rosh Hashanah that year. B'hinei b'briyat olam, when it came to the creation of the world, Haya boneh olamot, the Holy One created many worlds, v'hecharivan, and then destroyed them. Kemoshe katuv b'midrash, as we read in the Midrash, Shehaya shvirat hakalim, these broken vessels, which were the remnants of the worlds that God tried to create and then broke. Umehem asa olamot. From those broken shards, God created new worlds, the worlds that were to exist. Elu olam hatikun. These are the worlds of completion, of fixing. Umimela, and therefore, she'anu ro'im tzarot, when we see troubles, worries, problems, elu she'ovrim aleinu, when these terrible worries come upon us, and think about the worries he was facing. Nafshot Yisrael, and all of these worries come upon the souls of Israel. V'harbeh tamidei chachamim, and many scholars, tzaddikim, and righteous people. V'ovdei Hashem, servants of God, shene'adaru rachmanu aslan, who have gone missing, who disappeared, or suffering, who have died. V'chol ish Yisrael hasovel kokach, and every Jew who suffers so much, ata, now, u'vefrat mishen adar, and specifically one who has disappeared. Tzadikhu Hashem. We still have to believe that the Holy One is a righteous one. Yirachem will have mercy on us. The Yomar dai l'tzaroteinu, will eventually say enough of the despair upon the Jews. B'tzarot amo, and the worries of his people, Beit Yisrael. Az yod'im, therefore we know, shagam ata zman shel b'chirat shvirat hakalimu. We'll know that even now, even in the depths of our suffering, which by the way was only just beginning, even that might be a time of God's breaking the worlds in order to create new ones. Lachein tzrichim leitchazek yoter. Therefore, we've got to strengthen ourselves more. B'tshuva, in our own repentance. U'lachadsho ma'asechem b'briyah chadasha. And with our own actions, help create a new reality. It's stunning to me that someone could have such faith in the presence of such despair. One could say that's naivete. I don't. One could say that was ignoring the signs that suggest that calamity was everywhere. I don't read it that way. I read his saying to himself and to his people that one must always, even in the most broken of circumstances, harbor and cultivate a hope that perhaps this is the brokenness from which completion and rebuilding and reality will turn brighter. It was already really horrible for the Jews in Rosh Hashanah 1939. And still, he was able to give that kind of a sermon. If we import that stance into this moment, it will lead us into our first meditation. I'm going to ask you to close your eyes. And notice already the subtle shift in your consciousness by turning off one stimulus, one sense. You're still hearing and feeling. We're not tasting right now, but we are smelling. But just by closing off the visual world, we have entered into ourselves in a way that's impossible when we're constantly stimulated by what we see. If you haven't yet, please place your feet flat on the ground in front of you and feel the full area of contact between you and the earth. Pay attention to that which we very rarely pay attention to, and that is what is holding you up right now, the point of contact between you and the chair, your feet and the earth. Remembering the double dynamic of the gravity pulling you down, such that you might feel a heaviness, a weightiness that comes upon you, but also the firmness and the stability of that which is holding you up. Even a gratitude for that stability. And see if you can both be aware of the stimuli around us, because it's impossible to create a pristine stimulus-free zone. You're aware of a rush of a car. You're aware of the wind passing by your face, shuffling of papers, a person walking in or out of the service. These are not devious things, they're just present. But see if you can willfully push them to the periphery of your consciousness, so that the center of your consciousness is just you, your body, your mind, and if you like, and only if you like, my voice. Everything else exists on a secondary level, not needed for this moment. Without adjusting your breath in a significant way just yet, just be aware of it. Just be alert to that autonomous process that you can have focus on if you want. Thinking of each breath not as an automatic, but a luxury. Each filling of your lungs, your healthy lungs, with this air, today with clean air, as a miraculous moment that simply happens over and over and over again. We aim in meditation, according to one of my teachers, for poised rest. It is restful. It is tranquil. There is a serenity with no duties upon you, no obligations, no to-do lists, nothing pulling at you at this moment. The only thing in this moment is your resting mind. And yet we are poised. This is not the rest of the Western world, which is slouch and slack. This is the rest of a more Eastern tradition, of focus, tremendous presence, tremendous alertness. You are very poised in this moment, more aware of your breathing, of the position of your body, of the sensations in your fingers, your ears, and your shoulders, and your ankles. More awake than you have been all day. But you are at rest. Poised rest. Now let's breathe into this moment with 5 deep breaths in through the nose and out through the mouth. I won't count out loud, just count for yourself to bring you deeper into this poised rest. And inspired by the Piazetzner's pushing us to find hope, to identify worlds that are about to be created amongst the shards. I want to let your mind attach the word hope to anything that comes across your consciousness right now. It can either be things that you hope for. Remember that a hope need not be justified or deserved. It's not a demand, it's a hope. In this moment of travail and deprivation and change, worry, you may let come across your mind that which you hope for. In your mind's eye, imagine yourself saying it out loud. You can hear your own voice in your mind. Imagine yourself saying, I hope for, and hear yourself complete that sentence. And you can also think of it from a slightly different perspective. What is it that brings you hope in this moment? What blessings do you find amongst the shards? If you were listening to the Piazetzner sermon in September of 1939, without knowing the future, what hope could you have pulled from those trying circumstances? Going back to a Rosh Hashanah idea I shared, what is being born right now around you, in your world, in your realm, that gives you hope? What do you hope for? What gives you hope? When destruction is all around you, what are you creating?
and building like the Holy One who built this world from the remnants of other broken worlds. What do you hope for? What brings you hope? Yeah, 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 Yai da da yai 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 ay yai 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 da 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 yai dai 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 yai 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 da 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 yai 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 da 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 yai dai da dai 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 yai dai 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 yai 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 da da dai yai dai yai da dai dai yai da dai yai yai yai. And if you haven't yet, when you're ready, you can open your eyes. Having completed the first of several meditations we'll do. Again, welcome. Gajentif, it's nice to see you. I've mostly made eye contact with most of the people who are here and consider that to be my greeting you warmly and so gratefully that you're a part of this. And if you're watching online, wish you were here with us. And I hope that this experience transmuted through the technology makes you feel like you're a part of it. So we're going to be focusing on some different themes that we would be saying in the Machzor over Musaf, but approaching it not from a direct stance of individual prayer, but through the themes themselves and some meditations. So I want to focus on a prayer that originated in the High Holiday service and then became part of pretty much every service that a Jew ever does in prayer, and that's the Aleinu. It's so interesting. In weekday prayer, Aleinu is so ubiquitous, it's mundane. How frequently you get to the end of the service, and when it comes to the bowing of the Aleinu, like if you rotate your knees by 8%, you consider that to be a really good bow. Because it's hard to do the same thing over and over again and have it have meaning, anything. In the High Holiday liturgy, it's an apex. It's a crescendo. Right? People who know very little about the High Holiday experience know about the Aleinu. Aleinu. Maybe we should sing it to that tune on a Tuesday afternoon at Mincha and see what happened. Right? The Chazan goes down to the ground. The rabbi goes down to the ground. I encourage everyone in the Kahal to go down to the ground. We've lost something in our sanitized experience of liturgy and of the choreography of prayer, that we don't experience the full prostration of prayer. The Muslims have not, by the way. When Muslims pray, even their 5 times a day, over and over again prayer, wherever they are, they put down a mat and they bow down all the way to the ground, and it matters. It just matters. It's a different experience, a different sense of humility and obsequiousness if you're really on the ground as opposed to doing a quarter nod. But I want to focus for now not on Vanachnu Korim, which is the bowing part, but the first word, Aleinu. It's a very mundane word. It's, in Hebrew, you can take a preposition and decline it, add person to it. So al means on, upon, and aleinu means upon us. In English, we don't really have that. But in Hebrew, you can add the suffixes onto prepositions, and it becomes its own phrase. Al, on, like al aliyah, up. El al, right? Two up. Great name of an airline. Two up. Us. Aleinu. It's upon us. What does that mean? It's upon us. Right? In modern English idiom, we'd say it's on our shoulders, or it's on us to do something. It's an obligation. Is that what's being spoken about in the Aleinu prayer? Perhaps. The question is, aside from Aleinu l'shabeach, it's on us to praise, right? That's what the line says. It's our obligation to praise the creator of the world. Okay. What else? What else is upon us? What else do we feel as a sacred burden on our shoulders that we must do? And what else might the Aleinu be inviting us to consider? It's interesting that there is a interplay between up and down in the Aleinu. Because Aleinu means it's upon us, meaning we're raising it up to a level of significance, and al always means up. Up on our shoulders, up in our consciousness. It's on us. It's up there in the Klieg lights. And yet the way we express that in the prayer is by going down. Yerida. We descend all the way to the ground as a way of claiming that which is upon us. It's a really interesting dynamic that plays out a lot in the Jewish spiritual realm. That we go low to aim high. We fall to the ground to deepen our relationship with the God of the heavens. So there's a lot going on in the Aleinu that can be easily forgotten when you're saying it again at the end of a daily minyan service just before the Mourner's Kaddish, or even when you approach it in the Amim Naraim. So what we're going to do is a short meditation on Aleinu, a little shorter than the one we did before. And when we're done with it, we're going to sing Aleinu. And I'm going to encourage all of you, I can't force you, but I encourage all of you when we get to that part to do a yiridah, to do a prostration down to the ground and hold that position as a way of trying to understand how the sages who composed this prayer believed that by going down to the ground, we could articulate what was upon us, on us, imposed by the heavens. So again, close your eyes. Sometimes it's hard to go in and out of a meditation in a session because your mind isn't sure which mode to be in. And actually sometimes it's very easy because the descent into it is quicker. You were just there. You were just there again with your feet on the ground. Your hands perhaps palm down on your legs, almost gently caressing yourself. Or sometimes I like to do it palms up on the legs, fingers opened, a stance of acceptance and embrace of this grand world. And as we go into poised rest, Ask of your spine to do most of the work against gravity and let everything else wondrously hang. Your spine central and dignified, and as if all of your limbs beyond that were branches of a weeping willow, just allowed to be pulled down, to sag, to release some of the tension, to convert some of the tone of rigidity that this modern busy world requires of us into a lovely flaccidness that is soft and supple and which our bodies need to experience too. Ma alecha. What is upon you? Ma alecha. What duties or obligations are constantly on your shoulders? As a parent, as a child, as a spouse, as a friend, as a professional, as a citizen, as a Jew, as a servant of the Holy One. Ma alecha. And you can let examples in words or phrases fly by your mind's eye like comets. Some of those duties and burdens feel very burdensome. Things that are alecha that you wish you could shake off. You can tell yourself, you're not admitting it to anyone else. No one can read this moment but you. What is upon you, alecha, that you wish weren't? That is just too much. That weighs you down. It's on you, which means it presses down upon you, restricts your own ability to elevate and soar. That's what a yoke is. Give yourself the release and the catharsis of at least naming those things that are alecha, upon you, that you wish weren't. Wishing does not make them not so, but it creates mental space within which to experience those burdens slightly less onerously. Even perhaps aleinu l'shabeach, our burden to praise God, always, under every set of circumstances, when I'm angry, when I'm in grief, when the world is broken, alai l'shabeach, I must praise God. That can be a heavy burden, a heavy yoke. And some of the duties that come across your consciousness as you think of them, you may experience not as heavily burdensome at all, but as ennobling. Those things that are alecha, that raise you up, that give you purpose, that help others, that strengthen your relationship with the world, that gives your life a sense of meaning. You thank the universe that they are upon you, because if they had not been put upon you, you might not have chosen them for yourself, and you would be less burdened. but also impoverished for meaning. Ma alecha. What is upon you? And when you realize it is upon you, l'shabeach ladon hakol, to give praise to the Master of all. How do you do it? Just by saying the prayer? Just by uttering the words? Or do you praise the Holy One with your deeds and your righteousness and your convictions, which can feel both heavy and burdensome, and catapults into the heavenly realm at the same time? Ma alecha. What is upon you? Aleinu Leshabeach La'adon Hakol Lateit Gedula Yotze Bereshit Shelo Asanu Igoye Haratzot Velo Samanu Mishpachot Hadama Vanachnu Korim Malchei HaMelachim HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Yai na na yai yai yadarai yai nai nai yai 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 yadai dai yai didi dai yai dai dai yai yai yai. That repeats. Yai da da yai yai diddy die yai die die yai 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 da da yai yai diddy die. Yai die die yai yai yai. Ay 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 ay. Ay 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 ay. Yai die die yai yai yai. Yai 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 yai. Ay yai yai. Ay yai yai. Ay 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 ay. Ay 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 ay. Yai dai dan dai yo. I da die die, yai diddy die, yai nai nai, yai yai yai, yai da die die, yai diddy die, yai nai nai, yai yai yai. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, ay, ay. Ay, ay, ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, ay, ay. Ay, ay, ay. Ay, 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 ay. Key part of the liturgy of Yom Kippur, which we reach both in the Torah reading and also in a section of Musaf, is what we call the Avoda service. Avoda in Hebrew means a lot of things. It means service, it means worship, it means work. Here we're talking about the service, the worship service that the high priest would do in the Kodesh Kodeshim, in the Holy of Holies, when the temple stood. It's archaic, it's weird, it's so different than a modern Yom Kippur, but then again, this is also so different than a modern Yom Kippur. It goes way back into kind of primordial Jewish time, where we have barely memories, mostly fantasy memories, of a religious functionary who earned his title by birth and who somehow had a direct relationship, or at least ability to summon or call upon that relationship when he stood in the Holy of Holies in Yom Kippur. And we approached it several times on the day itself. And if we were in a traditional Musaf service, we would be at the Avoda service about right now. It's probably what Rabbi Chorny and Rabbi Warshawski and Schatz are leading in their Zoom services. There are three basic zones that the high priest would be in during the ancient preparation of Yom Kippur. The first was all prep. He would spend a week cloistered from his colleagues in the Holy of Holies, getting ready for the act, being reminded of the specifics of the rituals, being taught texts from the elders that he might have forgotten from last year. There's some cynical reads of this text which suggest that the reason why he had to be taught what to do is because there was corruption rampant in the ancient Jewish world, and you could buy the high priesthood, not necessarily earn it. And so he was not necessarily as learned a man as we might imagine. But if we take the non-cynical view, that he simply needed to be reminded, because we all do, he's being instructed. That happens for a week. Act 2 is today. He's in the Holy of Holies. There's no Zoom, so he doesn't know what's happening outside, although there are two things that tether him to the outside world. There's literally a string, a tether, that's attached to a part of his body. Why? such that if he fell ill or, God forbid, died in the middle of the ceremony, and they couldn't come in to get him because where he is extra nuclear in terms of God's presence, they would schlep him out so that the second in command could replace him. But the other way in which he's connected to the Jews outside of the temple is with bells. He has bells with him to signify when he has completed each of the 3 atonements, kippurim, for himself and his household, for all of the priests, and for all the people of Israel. Because there's no microphone and no Zoom and no live stream, the only way they knew that they had been moving through the process on the outside of the Holy Holies was when he would ring the bell. So they hear him. He doesn't really hear them, but he knows they're hearing him. And so they're connected. And so it's a very apt metaphor for Yom Kippur 2020, because the high priest, the functionary, and the people that he's performing the duties for are not at all in the same place, but they're very intimately connected. That's Act 2. Act 3, which belies the notion that Yom Kippur is only a weighty, heavy, afflict yourself holiday, is Mar'eh Kohen, what the Kohen looked like when he came out of the Holy Holies. His face full of splendor, shining for having gotten so close to God's presence, having achieved what he intended to achieve, a new year of life for the people. And the piyut, the poem that we sing at the end of the Avodah service, is not at all dour, minor key, self-flagellating, afflict yourself kind of music, which Avinu Malkeinu is and Shema Kolenu is. Mar'eh Kohen is upbeat and triumphant and celebratory. So what we're going to do is I'm going to send you into another meditation. We're going to try to be there with the Kohen Gadol. And when we come out of the meditation, we're going to sing pieces of the Mar'eh Kohen, which you can find on the sheets that you picked up on the way in. If you haven't picked them up, Susan's handing them out. So once again, I want to ask you to close your eyes. And once again, I want you to locate yourself and position yourself in your chair very intentionally. Nothing accidental about the position of your body, the movement of your breath in meditation. Once again, we push everything to the periphery of our consciousness, except for our breathing. And if you want, the focusing on the sound of my voice. Many paradoxes are at play in meditation. Here's one of them. I want you to focus on locus, to construct with your mind's eye, even though your eyes are closed, exactly where you are. Try to see through your eyelids and create the landscape that would be in front of you if your eyes were open. See yourself in your chair. Try to conjure without peeking, because this is not a test. Who are the people in your line of sight that are still there even though you cannot see them? Locate your chair in its position on this field and imagine the tent above us. And pull out and see this field, where it is on the campus. And like a drone, pull out so you see the campus where it is on the street. And where the street is in its neighborhood. And where the neighborhood is in the city. And where the city is on the coast, and where we are on the continent, and up and up and up, so that you are seeing and you know exactly where you are. Your mind's GPS incredibly accurate. And at the same time, holding on to that locus, to that thing you hit on a Maps app that identifies exactly where you are, with the power of your mind and your inherited tradition, I want you to not be anchored to this spot in this moment. Because in meditation, we are also anywhere and everywhere and anytime and every time. So you are both anchored in your seat in between La Cienega and Corning, close to noon on this day of Yom Kippur. And you are also soaring and traveling through space and time. And you find yourself in one of the centuries before zero, hovering over Mount Moriah. The Kotel, before it was the Kotel. The Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple. A place that you have been taught is meaningful to you, even though it seems so strange, so different, so anachronistic, so archaic. And you're watching the spectacle. And you see the Holy of Holies. And with your penetrating eyes, you see what others don't see. You see the Kohen Gadol, the holy priest, in the inner chamber, a bell in his hand, a string tied to his leg. Is he nervous? Is he afraid? Is he proud? Is he humble? Is he confident? Your drone's eye sees the throngs gathered, hundreds, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of ancient Jews, waiting expectantly, taught that what is happening inside that chamber, over which they have no control, itself has entire control over their well-being, their lives, their health, their families. Are they paying attention? Are they distracted? Are they focused and poised rest? Are they nervous? You hear the first bell, and you know that the high priest has said the formula that brings atonement for at least him and his family. Ahai, yadadai, 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 yai. You hear the second bell, which means he said the formula that brings atonement for all of his colleagues, all the Kohanim who are born to serve. Ahai, yadadai, 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 yai. You hear the third bell, the one that really matters for the majority of the people who are present. The formula has been said. Atonement has been granted to the Jewish people. The Kohen Gadol has done his job. There is belief that all who are present are inscribed in the book of life, even if they know in the back of their minds that obviously some of them will not complete the year. But in this moment, it's all success. It's all achievement. It's all celebration. Yadadai, 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 yadadai. And you floating above this all, you who remain you throughout this reverie, you hurtle through time and space, back from the 6th century BCE in Jerusalem to the 21st century CE, to this continent, to this state, to this city and neighborhood, to this campus, to this tent, to your chair. Wondering and waiting how what you saw on your journey of flight impacts your own sense of the weightiness and also of the exaltation of this day. You leave the Kohen Gadol behind, but you invoke him and all that that ritual represented as you open your eyes. Emet manehedar haya kohen gadol haya kohen gadol b'tzeito מבית קודשי הקודשים בשלום בלי פגע. Ya na 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 na, ya na 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 na, ya na na na, ya na 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 na, ya 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 ya, ya na 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 na, ya na 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 na, ya na na na, ya na na ya ya ya. כאוהל הנמתח בדרי מעלה, מהרי כהן, כברקים היוצאים מזיו החיות, מהרי כהן, כגודל גדילים בארבע קצוות, מהרי כהן, כדמות הקשת בתוך הענן, מהרי כהן, יאי נה 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 נה, יא נה 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 נה, יא נה נה נה, יאי דה דה נה נה נה, יאי 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 יאי, יא נה 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 נה, יא נה 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 נה, ya na na na, ya na na, ya na. Bottom of the page. כחסד הניתן על פני חתן, מהרי כהן, ככוכב הנוגע בגבול מזרח, מהרי כהן, כנר המציץ מבין החלונות, מהרי כהן, כשושנת גן בין החוכים, מהרי כהן, אמת מנהדר, היה כהן גדול, Haya Kohen Gadol B'Tzeito Mibeit Kodshei HaKodashim B'Shalom Beli Fega. Just about noon. Those of us who've been here since 11 have been thinking and meditating and singing for about an hour. And it's time in just a moment for us to move into the Yizkor mode where we'll hear Rabbi Schatz's sermon and pray the Yizkor service. But with Rabbi Schatz's indulgence, I'm going to ask that you close your eyes one more time. And one more time, use the tremendous power of your mind to have nothing matter but your breath, your awareness of your body, and the import of this moment. I want you to imagine in a serious way and not a funny way that your nostrils were in your belly, so that when you breathed in through your nose, you're not just breathing through openings in your face, but your belly, the deepest part of your body, you're taking in the air. A type of breath that you can't not but be aware of and grateful for. And as we end this meditative service with 10 breaths counted in your mind, but not out loud, 10 deep breaths in through your nose and out through your mouth, with your out breath being a little bit longer than your in breath, which is a sign of generosity, that you're giving to the world a little bit more than you're taking in. As we enter into this final extended breathing exercise, hold on to what you are feeling and thinking and experiencing in this moment, such that your poised rest almost makes a fossil on your consciousness that can be returned to, uncovered, and recovered as we move from this moment forward into the day and forward into the rest of our lives. 10 deep breaths. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes. And if you have been sitting and meditating for close to an hour, I invite you to stand up and move your body a bit, shake out a bit so you can move from meditative mode to sermon listening mode as we give Rabbi Schatz all of our attention and focus our poised attention and focus as she delivers her sermon. Let's just give them a few seconds to shake out.
No, it has to turn the other, like I have to stand on our side. Thank you. Great. Yes. And it's taller. No, it needs to be near my mouth. Probably. I can use that one if you want. Sure. Yeah, great. Stay better. Here. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Yizkor in the time of pandemic, a worldwide health crisis, 1 million people dead, 204,000 in our own country. Yizkor in a time of suffering and all the accompanying suffering, careers stalled, business establishments submerged in debt, mental depression, jobs lost, hunger, inaccessible health care, and loneliness. This Yizkor, who do we focus on? We come to Yizkor 4 times a year, and this is not the first time it has coincided with tragedy and pandemic. I introduced the first Unatana Tokef of Rosh Hashanah by admitting to fear of my own mortality. This year, more than any other of my life, I read the Unatana Tokef and could not as easily take for granted that I would be here next year, like I have naively assumed in the past. For 6 months, death tolls have risen. We physically distanced ourselves and put off friends, family, education, and all sorts of experiences. We have worn masks not only for ourselves, but for others. An almost impossible reality whereby interacting too close with those whom we love could effectively kill them. And hoped we are not threatening someone because we interacted too closely. As the numbers climb, we become guilty of news fatigue, an inability to even conceptualize what 204,000 lives really looks like. And with all of that, many of us have lost someone close, someone dear, someone who is not part of a big news story, but part of our life. Yizkor in the year 2020, we force ourselves to want to carefully recall each life, the lives we will now carefully name and acknowledge and remember and honor. A year full of what ifs, full of unanswerable questions, full of unanticipated loss, and full of moments where we wish we had had more time to ask and to learn and to make memories together. Our lives begin with questions, so we can learn about the world, allowing our brain to take in the magnificence surrounding us. Children ask, Why and how and what is that to soak up their world? Our lives, as we learn in Masechet Shabbat, also end in question. Rava said, after departing from this world, when a person approaches God after the life they've lived, the judges say to the person, did you conduct business faithfully? Did you designate times for Torah study? Did you engage in creation? Did you seek redemption? Did you engage in the conversations of wisdom or expand ways of learning? So what if we live a life of questioning the world and one another at all times in between childhood and death? What if we ask questions of our loved ones to learn as much about them as we can while still in their presence? Tell me about your loved one. A prompting question I offer as an open-ended experience for recalling the person who has died and who the family will bury in a few days. Often the meeting begins with biography, telling me about when they were born, their growing up, the moments where those around the table came into the picture. The biography slows down and the stories begin. Never in sequential order and often like a roller coaster, funny stories accompanied by thoughtful moments, accompanied by tearful retellings. Throughout the stories, those around the table begin to add a bit of the story that only they know, and then seamlessly bits of themselves. Yes, his newspapers were always stacked up on the ground, even as a kid. No, I think that she decided to go to that school because it would be easier for her parents. Oh, really? I never knew that Mom counted the number of Hanukkahs we had all been coming to her. Those we love are vessels full of stories, experiences, and sensations. And when the vessel is rendered lifeless and no longer guarding its contents, the onus falls on us. But as human beings, we forget. We will forget certain stories, jokes, smells, events. We will forget all that we once never thought to remember. Yizkor is a time set aside for remembering. Not mundane remembering, but purposeful, profound remembering. Yet our tradition sets aside this time as if we didn't set aside a time to remember, would the remembering get done? We approach Yizkor with questions and the yearning to remember the answer that will enhance a memory. But how will we feel about what we find in those memories? What do I not know about my aunt? What has my dad chosen to not share with me and my siblings? What was that joke that everyone still laughs at but can't remember who told it or how it went? Yizkor assumes that we too easily forget. We need structure and assistance to remember. A few years ago, my brothers and I drove down with our dad to visit his dad, our Saba, in Palm Desert. After lunch on our first day, something struck me to take a photo album off the shelf, and then another, and then another. Photo albums I had never noticed before, and that prompted Saba to get more from the back bedroom. We opened to pictures falling out of their sleeves, pictures we had never looked at, from his time in the Korean War, of their wedding, of our dad's dogs who we knew chased their tails but had never seen. We sat down and took in a whole bunch of life and asked thousands of questions. While thumbing through some birthday photos, I sat on the couch opposite my dad and Saba, and I teared up hearing these stories and watching my father's face light up as his childhood and his parents' lives flashed before his face. My dad asked, "Dad, why have you never shown me these pictures or told me the stories you're now sharing with my kids?" He answered, "Well, you and your siblings never asked." My brothers and I took pictures of the pictures. Suddenly, we felt like we needed to know more and more, and my dad was hearing answers to questions he never thought to ask. As human beings, we forget. We worry that we are beginning to forget all that we once never thought to remember. Our psalmist wrote, "Achat sha'alti meit Adonai ota One thing I ask from God I will request. Shivti beveit Adonai kol yemei chayai. That I could sit in God's home all of the days of my life. This verse from Psalm 27 is said each day, multiple times a day, from the beginning of our high holiday preparation in Elul through the end of the season. Each time, the psalmist reminds us to find one thing to ask, and yet it is never just one thing. For the psalmist, the request was to remain in God's presence every day of our life. Imagine your loved one as the object of that passage in place of God. One thing I ask from you, grandparent, parent, sibling, partner, aunt, uncle, child, is to be with you in your home all the days of my life, to have had the opportunity to spend all of our days together, by your side, learning about you, feeling your love, caressing your hand, and giving you kisses. We worry that we did not have enough time to take it all in. We worry that we will forget that which we did not imagine we would need to remember. As we go about our life, we are lucky to take loved ones for granted because it means we are living with them, not in fear of losing them. In an anniversary note to my grandparents, my aunt wrote, "We take you for granted." Not in the usual context that could be seen as a bad thing, but in this case, this is how I mean it. You give us a sense of security and sanctuary. Your love is our home. We know you love each other and by extension, the rest of us. And we know that you will be there to listen to us, to delight in us, to show curiosity. We do not stop to just ask those questions. One thing I ask you. And no matter what, there are always more questions that go unanswered, more stories that could have been told. What if, like the psalmist suggests, we asked one more question each day or wrote down answers to those questions that our loved ones might ask when we are gone? As our Torah this past week teaches, Zachor Yemot Olam, remember the days forever. Consider the years of generations past. Ask your parents and they will inform you. Ask your elders and they will teach you. One such Q&A activity happened around our Shabbat table years ago where the family asked questions and the person answered. Over many laughs and some surprise answers, one that caught everyone's attention was, what is the last sound you want to hear in your life? I don't remember others' answers, but my answer was, and always will be, the sound of my dad's voice. Thank God I have many opportunities to still take hearing my father's voice for granted. But that one question will now always have a correct answer. After all, to be with you all of my life is a goal that we know cannot be. But memories and conversations and answered questions live forever. I wonder, might there still be a way to ask even after someone is gone? Even if we can't ask and get an answer after the person has gone, sometimes we find new answers or truths for ourselves by continuing to share or ask into the wind. On an episode of This American Life called Really Long Distance, there's a story of poignant connection to those that we have lost. In March of 2011, there was that large tsunami in Japan. In the city Otsuchi, there were still 421 people missing at the time of this podcast. Yizkor Suzuki's cousin had died, and he was already having a hard time trying to figure out how to talk about it. So Yizkor went out and bought an old-fashioned phone booth and stuck it in his garden. It looks like an old-fashioned English one. It's square and white and has glass window panes. And inside there is a black rotary phone resting on a shelf, connected to nowhere. It didn't work at all, but that didn't matter. Yizkor just needed a place he felt he could talk to his cousin and air his grief. Putting an old phone booth in his garden overlooking the Pacific Ocean felt like the perfect solution. Because my thoughts cannot be relayed over a regular phone line, I wanted them to be carried on the wind. So I named it the wind telephone. Word of the telephone got out, and people all over Japan have been walking onto Itaru's property to talk on the phone to their missing loved ones. Thousands of people. Hi, Grandpa. How are you? I'll be in 4th grade next semester. Wasn't that fast? A lot of calls were just updates, like catching up on the phone. Grandpa, I finished all my homework. As the grandchild is walking out of the booth, he looks up to his grandma and says, maybe Grandpa will say he heard us. Others just come to the booth to stand in silence and cry. We had so many things we wanted to do together. I just wanted to talk with you again. Achat sha'alti. I have one more thing to tell you. Shivti beveit kol yamei chayai, to sit in your home, to be with you all of my days. Children updating grandparents on mundane life, partners expressing that they just wish for one more moment together. Any request is expressed into the wind telephone, and the mourner feels comforted in asking and awaiting an answer. When we left Palm Desert, I thought to myself, what other questions should we have asked Saba? Our curiosity had been piqued, and yet now I feared we had not asked enough. We will forget all that we once never thought to remember. His wife, my grandmarini, died with many questions left unanswered that I was not old enough or experienced enough to think to ask. That's normal, I suppose. And yet I think of her every Yizkor and try to imagine asking her and all those I've lost questions that I now have. My grandparents always end every encounter with, what other questions do you have for us? My answer is usually nothing, I don't think. And I wonder if one day, many, many years from now, God willing, I will regret that. So this year, I want to ask more questions. I want to live life in the present and realistically know that one day I will have questions that I wish I could ask. We have Yizkor 4 times a year to remember those who have died and to remind ourselves how to live within this holy community. So until next time, think of good questions you can ask someone you love. For we all wish we could spend our entire life surrounded by those we love and in their home. Live life knowing that we will, of course, forget all that we once never thought to remember, and that one question, just one question, could open up stories and answers to always be remembered. Achat sha'alti. What would your one more question be? Gemar Chatima Tova.
Shakoach, Rabbi Schatz. Thank you for those words, for how personal it was, how it got very deep into our hearts and spirits as we're listening to you, thinking about that one question. We're now going to move into the Yizkor service for everyone who's here present and for those who are watching on live stream or Zoom. And you should all have this book of remembrance in front of you. We're going to be reading out of that rather than from the Machzor itself. Rabbi Chorny will begin by reciting some of the verses beginning on page 4 and then switching to page 6, and then we'll read responsively on page 6. What was that? What's that? So I'm going to ask you to rise. The ark is open. Is Jessica here? Jessica Samuel? Jessica, so why don't you come forward to hold one of the Torah scrolls? David Herman, will you hold another Torah scroll, please? Okay. Okay, the first two lines on page 4, and then we move to page 6.
Adonai madam atidehu vein enosh vatachashavehu atam lahevil damayama kitzelave my nosh kistizerenu uven adam kitiv kedenu vatachasarenu mehad me Elohim v'chavod v'tar teterehu.
Page 6.
בבוקר יציץ וחלך לערב ימלא ויבש תשב אנוש הדקה ותאמר שוב בני האדום שובו אדוני עד מתי והנחם על עבדיך.
And please read with me responsibly. There is a time for everything. There is a time for all things under the sun.
A time to be born and a time to die.
A time to laugh and a time to cry.
A time to dance and a time to mourn.
A time to seek and a time to lose.
A time to forget and a time to remember.
This day in sacred convocation, we remember those who gave us life.
This day we remember those who enriched our life with love and with beauty, with kindness and compassion, with thoughtfulness and understanding.
This day we renew the bonds that bind us to those who have gone the way of all earth.
As we reflect upon those whose memory moves us this day, we seek consolation and the strength and the insight born of faith.
Tender as a father with his children, the Lord is merciful with his worshipers.
Adonai knows how we are fashioned. Adonai remembers that we are dust.
The days of humankind are as grass. They flourish as a flower in the field.
The wind passes over it and it is gone, and no one can recognize where it grew.
But God's compassion for God's worshipers, God's righteousness for children's children, remain age after age unchanging.
70 our years may number, 80 years if granted the vigor.
Laden with trouble and travail, life quickly passes, it flies away.
Teach us to use all our days, O Lord, that we may attain a heart of wisdom.
Grant us of your love in the morning, that we may joyously sing all our days.
שיביתי אדוני לנגדי תמיד, כי מימיני בעלמות. לכן שמח ליבי, וגם כאבותי, אך בשרי ישכון הוד בבטח.
When I stray from you, O Lord, my life is as death, but when I cleave to you, even in death I have life.
You embrace the souls of the living and the dead.
The earth inherits that which perishes.
But only in dust, the soul, which is God's, is immortal.
Adonai has compassion for Adonai's creatures. Adonai redeems our life from the grave.
During our brief life on earth, he gives us choices.
We can cherish hopes, we can embrace values, and perform deeds which death cannot destroy.
May we all be charitable in deed and in thought, in memory of those we love who walk the earth no longer.
And may we live unselfishly in truth and love and peace, so that we will be remembered as a blessing as we this day lovingly remember those whose lives endure as a blessing. If you turn to page 59, we'll sing the first few lines of Psalm 121, and after which I'll send you into the prayers that you can say on your own, which will be back on page 9. And after that, as you remember those who have lived and who have died, who gave you life and gave you love and who are still a part of your heart, the very people about whom, as Rabbi Schatz so eloquently invited us to do, we can imagine asking yet one more thing of, and perhaps hearing the answer in our minds. So first 159, then the personal prayers of Yizkor, and then we'll come out of that with some music as well. Shamayim va'aretz Ezri Me'im Adonai Osei Shamayim va'aretz. We'll give you as much time as you need to say your personal prayers. If you have some time after that, I encourage you to also look at page 57, a miniature section that we hope to expand on in future years, a section of personal zichronot, memories that members of our community have shared about loved ones that they're thinking about today. And we hope to expand that to be a full section that we can read through and really get into the hearts of those with whom we're sharing this Yizkor service. Page 9 and forward, and then the zichronot are on page 57. We'll now have Rabbi Chorny recite the El Mali Rachamim, the memorial prayer, first for the memory of all who perished in the Shoah, which can be found on page 14, and then to all those whom we remember today on page 15.
שוכין המרומים, ארצנו הנכונה, תחת כנפי השכינה, מעלות קדושים וטהורים, אזור הרקיע, מזהירים, לנשמות כל אחינו, בני ישראל שנטבחו בשואה, נשים וטף, שנחנקו ושנשרפו ושנהרגו, שמסרו את נפשם על קידוש השם, בגן עדן תהי מנוחתם. אנא בעל הרחמים, הסירים בסתר כנפיך לעולמים, וצרור החיים את נשמותיהם. אדוני הוא נחלתם, ינוחו שלום על משכבותיהם, ונאמר אמן. אל מלא רחמים, שוכן המרומים, המצאי מנוחה נכונה, תחת כנפי השכינה, במעלות קדושים וטהורים, כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים, ונשמות כל אלה שיזכרנו היום לברכה, בגן עדן תהי מנוחתם. אנא בעל הרחמים, הסירים בסתר כנפיך לעולמים, וצרור בצרור החיים את נשמותיהם. אדוני הוא נחלתם, ינוחו בשלום על משכבותיהם, ונאמר
Amen. Just before we say the Mourner's Kaddish, which will be on page 17, I just want to share with all of you, you who are here, you who are watching digitally, in the meditation Musaf that we did in this exact spot the previous hour, one of the things we focused on was Aleinu, the obligations, the duties, the burdens that are upon us. And some of those duties and burdens feel very heavy and onerous. And some of the things that connect us most powerfully to the purpose of what it means to be alive. I want to say, as a rabbi who's now been with this community for over 11 years, I was in my former community for 9 years, one of the things that has been alai, upon me, a duty and a burden and an obligation and a sacred thing, is to have been with so many of you during the very moments of loss that are coming across your consciousness right now. When I look literally at your faces and when I conjure the faces of the people who might be watching, there's an overwhelm. I remember individual Shiva services in living rooms, and conversations I had with you immediately after the death. and the discussions that Rabbi Schatz spoke about, where we ask, tell me about your mother, your father, your brother. And it's a powerful thing that you entrust to us to be there with you during such vulnerable and painful times. And while it's the case that it's only formally 4 times a year that the Jewish community gets together to recite Yizkor, when I see all of you, the totality of who you are, I also see the divots upon your souls and your consciousness that have been created by the losses that you suffered and that you were so emotionally generous to include us in and to share with us. So ze alai, that is upon me. Ze aleinu, it's upon us. As I know all of these losses are aleichem, upon you. And so as you are going to recite the Mourner's Kaddish right now for those whom you've lost and remembered, I will be in my own reverie, remembering cemetery chapels and gravesides and shivas and private conversations where you let us know something about someone that you loved. Mourner's Kaddish, page 17. Yitgadal, Yitkadash, Shemei Rabbah.
Amen.
Bi'alma divrach yirutei, bi'amlich malchutei. B'chayechon, v'yomechon, v'chayei dechol beit Yisrael. Ba'agala v'yizman kari v'imru amen. Yehei Shemei Rabbah mavorach, le'olam le'almei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach, v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnasei. Yithadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal, Shemei dekudesha b'richu. Le'ela, le'ela, min kol birchata b'shirata, tushbechata v'nechamata, damiran be'alma v'imru amen.
Amen.
Yehei shlama rabba amin shemaya, v'chaim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen.
Amen.
Oseh shalom b'mamav.
Huya
Hu ya'aseh shalom.
aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen.
Amen.
The scrolls are returned to the ark. And this is going to be something new for our community because it's a very abrupt transition. Yizkor is complete, and all of the services, whether traditional and truncated, Keva Kavana, or the early library meeting service that was here, or the Musaf Meditation, Musaf is done as well. So the next prayer service we're going to do as a community is at 5 p.m., which is Mincha, either on Zoom and live stream with Rabbi Chorny, anchor from the sanctuary. Is there also, no, there's no K squared. Or Hama'alot, which will be led by myself and Rabbi Schatz and Rabbi Joshua Showski and Rabbi Matt Shapiro and Cantor Michelle Stone, which will be available on Zoom or live stream. So the service is over. And it's also the case that at the end of Musaf, normally on Yom Kippur, I and sometimes the other rabbis linger for kind of an open-ended Q&A for things that just are coming up in your mind that you want to ask about Judaism, about the Jewish people, about Jewish history, about the synagogue, about anything. The rule is always you can ask anything you want, and I will choose which questions to answer. So just give me a second to just take off my talus. I don't need an extra layer of wool. As it's 140 degrees here. And then I'll move to the center. And then, I don't know, for 45 minutes or an hour or so, I'm happy to field your questions, and maybe some other clergy will as well.
Oh, yeah. Are you saying? Oh. Yeah, why don't we move the chairs onto the floor and sit on the floor? Yeah. Has he was on camera before? So, I want you to know that set up on the floor, or do you want
The Yizkor sermon is a challenging thing because it's basically saying the same thing every single time, right? Just a different frame. And I love how you did that, turn Akacha Alti into a personal thing. I love that image of the phone booth. That was very evocative. And I think it was very real and raw that you permitted your own emotions to come out a little bit.
I liked how you were talking about curiosity, and I knew that I was talking about questions the next day.
Okay. Are these mics on? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Who wants to start? And also, is there going to be a way, Kenji, for people who are on Zoom to ask questions?
Should I sit here? Can I sit here? Oh.
Okay, so if you're watching on Zoom, raise your physical hand or raise your digital hand, and you will be unmuted at the proper time to ask a question. I know there's at least one person watching on Zoom who may have been interested in asking a question. So the chair calls upon Sandra Braun. I'll repeat the questions. I might change the question as I repeat them to make it easier to answer.
It's a great question.
Okay, Sandra wants to know why my stender is bigger than whose stenders.
No,
It's definitely bigger than Rabbi Chorny's.
but not the.
Isn't it self-evident? These are custom designed stenderim that match the physical presence of the rabbis who will be using them.
Ours are the same. None of us are.
Okay, thank you, Sandra. She'll be here all week. Try the veal.
Great question.
Don't try the veal. Veal is straight. Okay. Who has a question? Yes, who is that? Tali. Can't hear.
Why do we say the mourner's Kaddish when someone has passed? The mourner's Kaddish doesn't ever talk about them. It doesn't ever. Why is that the prayer chosen?
Great. So Tali asked the question why we say the mourner's Kaddish, which if you've looked at it, says nothing about death, nothing about loss, nothing about memory. Why is that the prayer that's said for death? It's the result of a centuries-long organic process where something that was originally attached to something got reattached to something else. So the Talmud speaks about the fact that when someone has died, one of the things that you can, but if they're mourners, praise God's name. That does a service to the ascent of the soul of the person who died, because their loved one is still on earth praising God's name and not cursing God's name. Because you can imagine that it's instinctual, if you've lost someone, to not praise God's name. I don't want to say that Yid Gadal Yikadash Mebra. I want to say Yid Katan, right? May God's name be small because I'm so angry. So it's considered a feather in the cap of the soul of the deceased for someone to say Yehi Shmei Rabba Mavarach. That's one thing. Second thing is that originally the Kaddish was composed as a prayer that was recited after learning, after studying Torah. And we see remnants of that because there's something called a Kaddish de Rabbanan, the rabbi's Kaddish, which is recited in the morning service actually early on. If you get, when services start at 9:15, if you get here by 9:19, you'll hear that first Kaddish. And that's recited after rabbinic texts have been studied. And since it was also traditional back then that in memory of someone who died, you study rabbinic texts, that Kaddish was appended to that experience of studying text in someone's memory. And then at some point, the middle part disappeared, and it just became that, no, that's also the prayer we say when someone has died, even if we're not studying rabbinic text in that moment. So there's a much longer version of that history, but essentially it's both because that one-liner is supposed to be a celebration or something in the favor of the person who died, and that initially all moments of mourning were associated with studying texts, and the Kaddish prayer was recited after that. And then it just The Jewish tradition is kind of like entropy. It's always growing and never really being made smaller. So once it became that the mourner's Kaddish was attached to moments of death, it always will be that way until time immemorial. Yes. Yeah. Great. Paul asked a question. Why is it that on Rosh Hashanah, the first Torah reading had 7 aliyot, the second had 5? I can remember exactly where I was at Camp Ramah in the mid-'80s when we had a guest lecturer tell us something about the liturgy of Torah reading. And I don't know why this stuck in my brain, but I remembered it. On weekday readings, we read 3 aliyot. On Rosh Chodesh and Chol Hamoed, we read 4 aliyot. On Yantif, we read 5 aliyot. On Yom Kippur, we read 6 aliyot. And on Shabbat, we read 7 aliyot. And we read 7 aliyot on Shabbat, even if it's a Yantif. That had the Yantif been on a weekday, we only read 5. So the first day of Rosh Hashanah can appear on Shabbat. The second day cannot. So when the first day of Rosh Hashanah is a weekday, it's the same exact reading. It's just divided into 5 aliyot. But since it appears on Shabbat, you take 2 of those aliyot and split it into 2 so that we will indeed have read 7 aliyot on that day, because not only is it Rosh Hashanah, it was also Shabbat. Same thing for Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur, today we read how many aliyot? How many? 6. And had it been Shabbat, we would have taken, I think, the first one and divided it into 2, so that would have come up with 7 total aliyot for Shabbat and Yom Kippur. Kenji, you have a question? Okay, we got a question from Zoom. Daniel, do you have a question?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
I'm a visitor from Boynton Beach, Florida, and I have a question about the demographics of your synagogue. How many members do you have?
I'd like to know what's the second question. We have somewhere
That's it.
about 900 family units, something like that, 925.
Thank you.
The easiest question I've had in all the years doing the Q&A. Yes, I can't see. Who is that? Hi, Deborah. Why don't you come to the microphone so you don't have to shout?
I had a question regarding Rabbi Schatz. It's a story about the telephone booth.
Okay.
Wind, because what does the Jewish tradition say about that? About just speaking directly to loved ones who departed in that way, not necessarily in an empty telephone booth. You know what I mean? Like, that's something people do in many religions, like just talk to, like if you miss somebody and you want to think of them and talk to them, not in a service. What does Judaism say about that? I'm just curious.
First of all, did people hear the question? Is that mic on? That mic is not on. So maybe. Oh, okay.
You just repeat the question.
Okay. What's that?
Yeah, okay.
I heard the question.
Yeah, okay.
The question was, how many members does Temple Beth Am have? No. The question was relating to Rabbi Schatz said in her sermon, maybe I'll have Rabbi Schatz answer this, is how does Judaism feel about the notion of speaking to your departed loved ones, not kind of only or especially as part of a formal service, but just invoking them in your mind and speaking to them? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Do you want to answer that, Rabbi Schatz?
Sure. I actually don't know if it says that it would be okay or it wouldn't be okay. I think that it goes back to the idea that we say mourner's Kaddish and that we have time periods of mourning, that we do Shiva, we do Shloshim, you have the year, you have different Yizkor periods, that we're always supposed to be thinking of the people who we've lost and be
Rabbi
able
Schatz, pause 1 second.
Yes.
I love the 4 men in the back of the tent very much. I'm just going to ask them to lower their voices a little bit.
Unless
Thank
they
you.
have the answer to the question.
But I do love you.
They can come up here. So I think it's the case that we are always supposed to be thinking of the people who we've lost and find ways in which we can speak to them. Maybe Rabbi Kligfeld knows if there's exact rationale around how and why and when. But what I was going to add to the question about Mourner's Kaddish that I think Tali raised was that the way that Mourner's Kaddish is written is that you are supposed to say the words, and then the community is supposed to interrupt you in a certain way and say, Amen, we hear you, we're with you. So if what is bringing you comfort in remembering someone, especially if you are alone and not in community and with the ability to say Kaddish, to be able to speak to your loved one with a phone booth or without, I think is a properly Jewish thing to be able to do. And I can't imagine any reason that it would be seen as something that would be improper or some kind of idolatry or anything like that.
Yeah, I agree. I can't think of a place in Jewish text that speaks to it directly. I think some of modern American, somewhat antiseptic Judaism has gotten uncomfortable, unfortunately, with rawer versions of rituals. Some of what I have done and experienced in the last few years in kind of dipping into other religious traditions, not faith statements, but forms of ritual, have allowed me or invited me to introduce back into our very structured observance of Judaism things that are a little bit more unscripted. And I think that opens up the tradition a little bit. And so sometimes at Yizkor, I didn't say this today, but sometimes I have said it, when you are saying the Yizkor paragraph about your mother, about your father, about your brother, about your sister, also leave space in your mind to speak to them. I do think that speaking in the second person to a you is very different than speaking about a him or a her. Baruch atah Adonai. We don't say blessed is the Lord. We say blessed are you, Lord. And I use this all the time. Many of you, I'm trying to think of anyone who's here for whom I've done a baby naming. Yes. Okay. So sometimes at a baby name or a bris, I'll tell the couple, instead of when we get to the place of talking about the name, don't speak to us, the audience, about your baby's name. Speak to your baby, who's not like listening and understanding, but it draws upon a different emotional reservoir if you're speaking to your child and telling him or her what his or her birth means to you and what the name means to you, than if and we'll just listen in on that private moment. So I think that in general, we should be crafting more of those private moments in ritual that access a different immediacy when it comes to loved ones or people who are alive.
I just wanted to add one thing based on the story that I shared in my sermon that you used as the basis for your question. I think one of the most powerful points of that story is not that the people sharing thoughts with their loved one, that they actually believed that that person was listening, but that it was a cathartic way for them to bring the person to mind.
Right.
So I think that if, like what Rabbi Kligfeld just said, if you're able to speak to them in the you, or even say their name and say your statement, that's for you. That's not for them. And so to be able to remember the person by having that personal connection still, I think is extremely powerful.
Right. And then one more association with that, Rabbi Schatz, that also can relate to prayer.
Right.
Do you have to believe that God is listening for it to be powerful for you to say Baruch atah Adonai?
Right.
If the former were true, far fewer people, I think, would pray regularly, because it's in the realm of faith, whether or not there's a supernal one who's taking account specifically of our prayers. But Heschel would say that the experience of your articulating your prayers to the Holy One, independent of whether or not the Holy One is hearing those words, is the foundation of a spiritual life. Yes, Kenji. Carl Sunshine? Great. I love Carl's questions. Carl, go ahead.
Okay, I have a question about Kol Nidre.
Okay.
Struck me this year. I was reading the marginal notes, I think, and it said it was originally written to be retroactive and would cancel vows you had not fulfilled in the past year, which kind of makes sense to me, because if you hadn't made it by the end of the year, okay, please forgive me, let me off. Then it was changed to be prospective and apply to the coming year, which seems to be very undermining of all our good intentions for the coming year to say in advance, they don't count, they're not for real, they don't matter. So could you comment a bit on that?
Rabbi Chorny is going to start.
I love that question. I'm going to answer it one way and then add another thought and then pass it off to Rabbi Klickfeld. So one thought is just, I think there are different ways in history. I don't know where to look, Carl, because I like that I have your face over here, but I'm looking at you. And by the way, there are like 90 people joining us on the Q&A. So it's very nice, and a full tent and a full Zoom house. Carl, Kol Nidre is not the only liturgy where this happens, where I think the liturgist can't decide, is it that the idea is that we want to get rid of the vows from the past year, or is it that we want to sort of set ourselves up for an easier year to come? The same thing happens in the liturgy for the prayer for the new month. In Mavarchi Machodesh, the same exact thing happens. So you find some prayer books where we have ourselves blessing us also for the month that has passed, and we have some liturgies that bless us for this month and the month to come, right? So the month that came before to this month, and this month to the month to come. And I guess if you go to like the wrong two shuls, you could wind up skipping, if you do the math right, you could wind up like skipping a month of blessing in between. So I think that you could look at it either way. Which is it that you want to accomplish in which of those two liturgies? Is it that you need that in that moment, you need the cathartic cleansing that goes along with the theme of the season? Or is it that in looking into the next year that you know already, having seen yourself this past year, that you need to get rid of the vows to come? And they're two just liturgical traditions in competition with each other. And I'll also just seize on this moment to share a thought that I shared with Rabbi Klickfeld earlier this year, which is to say that, as you point out, it really is just a legal statement. It's just a legal declaration in that moment. And the thought came to me this year that it's become something very similar to a ketubah text, right, which itself is just a legal declaration. And at some point, somebody decided that it would be a really wonderful thing if we would take this legal declaration and turn it into a piece of art. I say that about a ketubah. I bet many people who are here with us some way have a ketubah as a piece of art hanging on their wall, even though that's just a legal declaration, one to the other, of the promises of, God forbid, what would happen if the marriage were to dissolve. Promises to one another of keeping each other together, and yet it was turned into a piece of art. And look at Kol Nidre, same thing happened. People took this legal declaration and they just turned it into a piece of art. And this year we just had to dial it back in person a little bit to a declaration again. But I think either way, it's an interesting piece of liturgy. It just depends on what the liturgist who edited the Machzor chose to do with it.
Yeah, I would add briefly, I also love that question, Carl. It's kind of a weird thing that if you ask the least educated Jew to name 5 prayers they've ever heard of, Kol Nidre is one of them, right? Shema, I don't know, Aleinu, Mourner's Kaddish, Kol Nidre. So it's become a famous piece of Jewish liturgy. Adon Olam, right? And maybe Akdamut. No. But it's odd that it did, because there's nothing about, first of all, it's not even a prayer. It's not a prayer. It doesn't invoke God's name. And there's nothing about it conceptually that is significant to a Jewish ethos. If anything, the opposite. And the historical shift that you made reference to, Carl, had to do with the fact, if I remember correctly from, I haven't thought about this exact question in a long time, from my liturgy class in rabbinical school, was that there was some discomfort with the fact amongst the sages of the time that getting to Kol Nidre and retroactively nullifying all the vows you made last year was just too convenient. It was just too cheap. Like, so I'm going to make vows and promises, but I know as I'm making them and vowing them that if I don't fulfill them, it's okay, because I'll just say Kol Nidre, they're all nullified. I'm a clean slate. I think the intention was to be able to start the new year with a clean slate, but it was achieved too easily without work. The paradox for me, maybe it's not a paradox, maybe it's just an ironic thing, that the switch from the going backwards to forwards is equally cheap. It's saying all the promises I'm about to make this year, I don't really mean. it doesn't really mean I don't really mean them, but it means that I don't want to be held religiously accountable for something that I really am expressing as a wish. I don't want you to tell me it was a vow. I also think it's almost impossible for us to understand anything about this prayer because we don't really live in a world of religious vows. We use the words I promise, I swear all the time, but we don't live in a religious community where making a neder had religious significance, that somehow we owed something not only to the person we made the promise to, but to God. Maybe sometimes we think we do that, but in earlier times, in temple times, right, there's a whole part of the sacrificial system that was related to oaths that you made, that once you made them, they were as incumbent upon you as I imagine all of you feel it's incumbent upon you not to eat or drink today. You know that it's a religious obligation. Whether you fulfill it or not is up to you, but you know it's a religious obligation. In that Jewish world, if you made a neder or a shvuah or a whatever one of the names are, a kinus or a kinui, that took on religious significance that obligated you in the same way you're obligated to God before. And so these are the rabbis trying to say, we mean what we say, but we don't mean what we say. We want Jews to take their word seriously, but not that seriously that they become ensnared in promises they never intended to make. So the resolution of the discomfort, I think, is actually equally uncomfortable, which is why, as Rabbi Chorny says, the prayer remains as like a relic, that mostly what the prayer means to the modern Jew is Yom Kippur's beginning, right? Like Kol Nidre does not mean, oh, I have to think about the significance of my oaths. It means I'm not going to eat for 25 hours, right? And that's why it, I think, has retained its position in our community, not because of the meaning of the words, which are interesting, but it's like its position and the day and its tune. Although there are many tunes to Kol Nidre. No, just kidding. Okay, who's next? Yes. Yes, please. It's so hard to see. I know it's hard to see who's there. Oh, hi. Yes. Hi, Lisa. Okay, come closer to the mic so everyone can hear the question.
Hi, I'm Lisa Chaikin. I had a more general question about Israel.
Okay.
I was just wondering if any of you can comment on the recent Abraham Accords and how you interpret that.
Yeah. So Lisa's asking about the recent Abraham Accords where there was a peace treaty or peace agreement signed between United Arab Emirates, whose capital really is Abu Dhabi, and Bahrain. I have a lot to say about that, and I only say a portion of it, and I'm not going to put my colleagues on the spot, but I'd be interested to hear what they had to say if they want to. I feel guilty that I succumbed to nervousness and didn't, in the days after the peace treaty, put something on my Facebook page congratulating Israel and the Jewish people that added a third and a fourth Arab country to the list of those with whom we have at least nominal peace. The reason why I resisted is because nothing is easy these days. Nothing is unpoliticized. Nothing is Democratic or Republican. Nothing has nothing to do with the president of the United States, who is, who was, and who might be. Everything is so complicated, and I myself got so pulled into that complication of whether or not my celebrating this agreement would somehow say something about my American political ideology, when really it was just an expression of my Zionism, because of the American president, who is a lodestone for many people, and certainly people have strong feelings about him because of his being the one to have orchestrated it. Listen, it was not I don't believe it to be a cessation of war the way it was in Egypt in the 1970s, or even with Jordan, because the UAE and Bahrain were never in active war with Israel. When you're on, when you've been on the Golan Heights, you haven't been nervous about Bahraini tanks coming down the hills, nor during the seasons of eras of terror in Israel, were you concerned about Dubaian suicide bombers. So it's not as monumental as the peace treaties with Egypt or Jordan. It also didn't require nearly as much surrender on the part of the state of Israel. The reason why I champion it and celebrate it is because for decades, the Arab world I believe, chose to conflate Muslim piety, which is on its own face laudable, with an anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic understanding of the presence of Jews in the Promised Land, and therefore attached all of their power to the claims of the Palestinians, some of which might be legitimate and some of which may not, and therefore made it impossible for natural relationships to be created in a region that is far more complicated than whether or not we go back to the 1967 lines. And the Khartoum conference in the aftermath of the Six-Day War, where the Arab League basically said en masse, no to negotiations, no to the acceptance of Israel, no to peace, that dominated Arab and also, not exclusively, but also Muslim understandings of the Middle East for 50 years. Part of that dynamic, of course, is created by Israel's own decisions about what to do in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank. Undeniable. And that is, and as I spoke about a little bit in my Yom Kippur sermon, that is still a very tricky issue that I don't see an easy solution to. But I think so much of that was clouded over, or so much of that clouded over otherwise normative ways that citizens of countries in the Middle East could at least throw to Israel the basic recognition that they throw to every other country on the planet, which is that we may have disagreements with you, we may wish that your policies were different, but we recognize that you exist, and we're not passively or actively standing with those who are working actively such that you not exist. So I hear Bahrain and UAE saying to Israel and to the world, Israel exists, and we stand behind Israel's perpetuating. And part of that may have to do with the military industrial complex and how many fighter jets they're going to get out of the accord. I get that. I understand. I'm sufficiently understanding of realpolitik to know that that's the case. But that's also too fewer countries that have some clout in the region saying, if you are standing on the side of those who suggest that Israel has never existed and ought not exist, we are no longer with you. I think that's significant. It's not because there's less war now between Israel and any of its neighbors, but there's more of a chance of an understanding of perpetuity. And the one thing that a country deserves is to at least be acknowledged that it is real. It is real and flawed. It is real and has work to do. It is real and imperfect. It is real and broken. It is real and not yet lived up to the soaring words of its Declaration of Independence, like the United States hasn't either. But it's here. And we're not going to let one single issue that has been dominated by a single population and has dominated that conversation, I think, sacrificing national aspirations on the altar of just destroying the Jewish state, or intending to, not letting that one point serve to be the prism through which all of the region is understood. So this is me speaking, like kind of pretending to be a political pundit, but mostly as a rabbi. I, as a Zionist, support and celebrate and laud the fact that there are two more countries in the world amidst a bloc who for 50 years were not even willing to recognize it existed, now saying it exists. I tell you a story. When I was on my sabbatical a few years ago, the last meditation retreat I did was in India. Went to Goa, India for a meditation retreat. And not for any other reason other than that the flights worked and it was pretty inexpensive. I flew Etihad Airline, which is the airline of Abu Dhabi. There's Emirates Airline, which is Dubai, and Etihad Airline of Abu Dhabi. Because you flew nonstop LA to Abu Dhabi, long flight, and then Abu Dhabi to Goa. So you know how when you're on an airline and you have the interactive maps on big airlines with screens where you can like zoom in and see what you're flying over, and you can have the wing view and the pilot view, and you can see like what's happening right underneath you, either digitally or on a real camera. So I enjoy that stuff. And when you have a 17-hour flight, you'll do anything to keep your mind occupied. So I'm just playing around. I forgot that this is so close to that. And I'm zooming in, zooming out, Abu Dhabi, Dubai. And the technology on this plane is very, very high tech, and you can zoom into neighborhoods in Damascus like a Google map. Like they put it all on there. I noticed that when you put the map centered around Israel, you can see Beirut and Damascus and Amman and Riyadh and Cairo and nothing in between. It did not exist. I almost had admiration for how well they use their ideology to impact their computer programming. Because in every other part of the globe on that device, you could zoom in close. When you got to where Israel's in the picture, you could press plus, plus, plus as much as you want. It wouldn't zoom in further, indicating to everyone who's curious, Israel does not exist. Now it does. Now it does, that if you're flying Etihad Airlines, I would like to think that you could use the map function to actually see the borders of the state of Israel and the city of Jerusalem. Does that mean that there's, messianic peace in the Middle East? No. But I think it's a big deal. And I think it'll continue to be a big deal. And I think, I'm going to say this as carefully as possible. Every person wishes that the things that they wanted to happen geopolitically happened by hands of the person they wished that had been in power. And there have been many presidents who've served the United States of America that I wish would have been responsible for shepherding along accords like this. And I celebrate the accords, and I celebrate the domino effect that I think is going to put painful and important pressure on feckless Palestinian leadership to finally put their own people's needs and wants in the front of their diplomacy. I think this is going to put pressure on them, and if they respond to that pressure positively, it's going to put pressure back on Israel to make some heavy concessions. That's what making peace means. But I think that the extent to which some of Palestinian leadership is isolated because some of the Sunni Arab countries are basically saying we're no longer going to be in this cesspool with you, hopefully might force them to make decisions they could have made 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40 years ago and refused to. And I think that's a good thing. Yes, is that Adam? Hey. Yeah, come on up.
So this is a pretty broad question.
Okay,
but,
broad question.
Yeah. In general, Jewish law always assumes that you're keeping the law. And for example, if a Jew would go to his rabbi and say that he's not Shomer Shabbat, but what should he do, like, in order to do it the right way, even though it's, and I'm not talking about like a sanctioned way of breaking Shabbat, like Pikuach Nefesh or Kala Achar Yad or anything. Like, do you know of any sort of sources or any ways of approaching those kinds of questions that, I guess like a responsible halachic answer would just be, well, you shouldn't break Shabbat in the first place.
I think I know what you're asking, but I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Can you say it a little bit more, Adam?
Right. Okay. So.
And say it a little closer to the mic so people can hear you.
Oh, sure.
I'll just say he's asking a question about how the assumptions in Jewish law is that the people who are asking the questions either are observing or want to be observing it correctly. Right? If someone asks a rabbi a question, that the assumption is they want to hear the right answer for the right way to handle a situation.
Right. So what I'm asking, I guess, is are there any conversations in Jewish law or sources that talk about how a Jew would go about breaking certain Jewish laws, like if there are priorities, and like should you do something without wearing a kippah or something like that, for example?
Right. It is a broad question, an interesting one. I think what you're asking is, are there places in Jewish law where the assumption is not just, I want to observe the mitzvah on the highest level, please tell me how, but I'm dealing with competing values in the halachic tradition, and I may have to put one value over another. Is that what you're asking, Adam?
Right, yeah.
I think Hannah Chorney knows.
I think I might have an idea. The first time I encountered something, but tell me, I'm not going to get too deep into it until you tell me that this is what you're getting at. Okay. I read a tshuva for the first time, but bear with me for a second. there was a tshuva that was written by Rabbi Miriam Berkowitz, along with some other colleagues of ours, some years ago, about contraception, the use of birth control in Jewish law. And it basically introduced this concept in the observance of Jewish law that I love, which is a ladder of observance. So it's like, listen, ideally, like the way that you observe contraception is that if you're going to use contraception, you use this kind of contraception. But if you're not going to use this kind of contraception, then the next best kind of contraception that you would use, well, like this kind would be oral contraception, would be kind of the top of the ladder. And then if you're not going to use the top of the ladder of oral contraception, then like the next kind would be like this kind of device. And here's why, and here are all the principles that would inform why that would be. And if you're not going to use that kind, then the next best thing that you would possibly use would be this kind, and the next would be this. The same, just to leap to another idea to make sure maybe that this is possibly an answer to your question, would be theoretically one could apply this idea of observance to kashrut, as in ideally when I am out and about, I should only eat at a kosher restaurant, only with things that are made on kosher appliances, meaning in kosher vessels with kosher cooking utensils, et cetera, served on kosher kept plates, et cetera. It's like separate everything. But if I'm not going to do that, then the next best possible thing would be that I only eat cold dairy out or at only exclusively vegan restaurants. And then if I can't find one of those, the next best thing might be that I eat cold sushi with non-spicy elements, and the next best thing and the next best thing. Am I anywhere near an answer to a question and the idea along those lines?
Yeah, it's the right kind of path.
The right path that you're getting?
Right.
So I'm intrigued. I'll say, I don't know if do you want more answer or more engagement on it?
Anyone wants to say on the topic is
I will say one last sentence on it and see if my colleague has anything to say in response to this idea. I am compelled and intrigued and driven by the idea that I think that most Jewish people who are on the path to living an observant life actually naturally observe somewhat in that vein anyway. Most of the time are operating somewhat on a path like that most of the time. Most of us are not able, if we are interacting with the secular world, the non-Jewish world, the non-observant world, the non-orthoprax, so to speak, orthodox world all the time, are operating in some sort of a vein like that most of the time. And I'm compelled by the idea that there's like a ladder like that. I don't know if
I guess my question, this isn't an answer to your question. This is a question for you to maybe give me thought for an answer to your question. I'm curious where your question comes from. Like, what's the history of your question? What's behind the question that's asking you, that's begging for you to ask it? Because it might be helpful for us to either know if there's an example or something that has been challenging or has been a blessing for you that has pushed you to ask this question.
Okay. It's actually a question I had for a long time, and someone actually was talking to me about it when I was in high school at Shalhavet High School. And I remember like the rabbi didn't really have really an answer for it because, of course, like the responsible answer is not to kind of encourage and name a way that you should break halacha.
Right.
And it's just something that I was always thinking about. And I think kashrut was actually probably the thing I was thinking most about as an example.
I read an article a few years ago in the Jewish Journal by Dennis Prager. Some people really love Dennis Prager. Some people really hate Dennis Prager. That's fine. Sometimes even people you disagree with a lot say interesting things. He wrote a fascinating article that was at least tangentially related to this, Adam. He was saying, how come it's the case that in normative Jewish practice, at least when it comes to ritual things, observant Judaism takes a yes, no, up, down, black and white approach. Do they keep Shabbat? Do they not keep Shabbat? Do they keep kashrut? Do they not keep Shabbat? Kashrut. Are they observing Pesach? Or are they not observing Pesach? We're constantly putting people into the category of whether they do or they don't. But in some areas of Jewish practice, there's a built-in ladder that is just implied, understood, and beautiful. And he gave his example, tzedakah. You don't look out amongst your call and say, this person gives tzedakah, this person doesn't give tzedakah. This person gives some, this person gives more, this person gives much more compared to what they can, right? It is a range, right? And it's a range that allows people who who only give 8% of their post-tax income rather than 10% of their post-tax income to still be able to say, I give tzedakah. And to be able to come in front of their rabbi and say, I fulfill the mitzvah of tzedakah. And the rabbi can say, yes, beautifully so. And here are some ways you could do more of that. But it's not acceptable. And he would say, unfortunately, and I agree with him, for someone to come to their traditional rabbi and say, I observe some kashrut. I observe a lot of kashrut on a lot of days. I eat the food that the tradition asks me to eat, and I avoid the food that the tradition asks me not to eat. And I want to get credit for that because I'm trying to live most of my food life in the rubric of Jewish tradition. Why can't we applaud that? I observe a lot of Shabbat. I spend a lot of the hours of most Shabbatot doing a lot of the things that Judaism is supposed to do on Shabbat. So why should it be that if I make this decision occasionally, that puts me out of the category of observing Shabbat? He's taking basically a kind of a reform movement's approach to personal choice when it comes to observance and challenging traditional Judaism, challenging orthodoxy and traditional Judaism to give space for it. And it actually has made me rethink my own observance of both Shabbat and Kashrut and others. Right? When I was a younger rabbi, I did think of it more black and white. There are members of my community who keep Shabbat. There are members of my community who don't. What a terribly limiting way of thinking about the whole array of human decisions. Everyone in my community is observing a significant amount of the holiday of Shabbat in a way that's meaningful to them. And maybe my job as a rabbi is to find more ways for them to do it more consistently. So I do think that built into the tradition is an acceptance and a malleability of a range of observance patterns, and that it ought not be that a person asking a rabbi a question has to assume that the rabbi assumes that you want to do it perfectly right, but you want to be in the game. And I think that that is worthy of applause.
I think that Rabbi Shapiro has an answer, but I wanted
Rabbi
to say
Shapiro,
one quick
of all
thing
people.
before he literally jumps up here.
Tigger.
I was just the reason I asked you to share with us what the background, what the history was of your question is because, as Rabbi Klickfeld just mentioned, I think that it's about access. I think that it's about you sitting down with somebody, hearing their question, and you being able to engage with them and what their access point needs to be. So if someone comes to me and says, I've never kept kosher a day in my life, I'm not going to say, great, let me tell you all the ways that you're going to kosher your entire home. You're going to only eat at kosher restaurants and you're going to move on with your life. You're going to take steps. And so I think that, to me, one of the best ways to go about thinking about a life of observance is to figure out what's that way in, what's that access point, so that you can touch someone, not just because it might be the quote unquote right thing to do based on a book, but because it's the thing that's going to make them feel the most meaning towards the mitzvah. I'm going to give our jumping rabbi the last word.
As long as it's not iterative.
I hope we're losing steam here. I hope our live stream audience is going a little bit strong. But hi everybody, Gmar Chatima Tova. When I still get it sometimes that you can sit down if you want. By the way, you've been standing up a very long time. You know you asked a great question when you get all four of us giving us extensive answers. So in and of itself, Yasher Koach on the question. I get it sometimes at Beth Am. I got it more at Beit Tshuva where I worked for a while. I'd start talking with someone and they'd come up to me and they'd say, Rabbi, I'm just a bad Jew. Right? You guys ever hear that? Right? People come up to you and say, I'm a bad Jew. And usually what they meant, 9 times out of 10, was not because out of any ethical considerations, right? Or any specific principles, but because they hadn't gone to synagogue, right? Because they hadn't been eating the right foods, right? There were certain core ritual components that they knew about, that they felt guilty about, that they felt like they should be doing, but they hadn't been doing. And I think to walk around with that frame of I'm a bad Jew is so destructive, right? And counter to any of the lovely sort of constructs that have been thrown in terms of a ladder of observance, in terms of working towards something, right? But that doesn't come out of nowhere, right? Somewhere along the way, whether because of their own guilt and their own regret, or because someone sort of reflected that to them, they got the memo that because they weren't doing certain things, they were a bad Jew, and therefore that burdens them with this sense of oi, right? So of all days on Yom Kippur, I think it's a great question to ask. I think, like, if only to like flip it around, and Rabbi Kligfeld was getting into this a little bit, if only we held ourselves to the same standard when it comes to everything we heard about in the Haftarah today, right? About doing acts of justice and kindness towards the poor and housing the unhoused and clothing the naked and feeding the hungry. If only we held ourselves to anywhere near the standard that some of us hold ourselves to when it comes to ritual observance, right? That would be phenomenal, right? And so I think it's not just a question of, is there a construct through which we can approach this, but where are we even applying this construct of observance, right? How are we applying that same level of questioning to sort of every area that our tradition calls us to answer? And I think the idea in and of itself of asking the question, of saying, how do I go about thinking about this? I'm grateful you asked it, and clearly it's a great question again, because you got answers. You got answers from all four of us. So I hope that at least one of the four of us, maybe even more, gave you something to think about. So thank you for the question.
So I think there are two Zoom questions waiting. There's Scott and Natasha. Let's go to Natasha first. Natasha, what's your question?
Hi, hello. I just well, first of all, this will be my second year observing Rosh Hashanah with Temple Beth Am, and I'm completely overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness and the strategy behind, putting together this Zoom call. I was actually watching all this morning on YouTube, and when you asked the audience if they had any questions, I couldn't hop on fast enough. So I guess I will filter my question through Adam's question, and it mostly pertains to what the Torah says and what Temple Beth Am says about this particular question I'm getting ready to ask. So I'm fairly new to the Jewish community. I'm a single mother of a young child, and I'm curious as to what the Torah says and what Temple Beth Am says about single mothers and fatherless children, and what is the all right, let me start there. What does the Torah say about fatherless children and single mothers, and what does Temple Beth Am say about that?
Got it. Thank you, Natasha. And I kind of see you through the glare of the box in between where I am and where the screen is. But I know you, and I know your face, and it's lovely to have you a part of this. And thank you for those kind words. The Torah itself doesn't really have an example of a fatherless child the way you are describing it. The Bible has examples of children of parents, one of whom passes away, right? So, in fact, in the book of either when parents or spouses pass away, there are people who are left lonely, but there isn't a specific description of the situation I think you're describing. So I think we have to pull out and ask more broadly, what does the Torah say about parents, and what does Temple Beth Am says about parents? Because I would think that whatever the Torah and Judaism and Temple Beth Am says about parents, it says about parents whether they are in a relationship, in a marriage, raising a child together, or under any set of circumstances raising them alone. I think what the Torah and the Jewish tradition and Temple Beth Am says about parents is that they are to be revered. They are to be held in awe by their children and also by the community for what they're doing. And that if they are giving love and guidance and structure and safety and transmitting the tradition such that, as the Torah says over and over again, specifically about the Pesach story, that if your child asks you the question, will you have an answer for them? We had that in the Torah reading for Ha'azinu over Shabbat. She'el avicha v'yagedcha, ask your father, and he will tell you, Zekinecha v'yom lulach, ask your elders and they will report it to you. If you're in a relationship with your child where you're transmitting the values and the stories of our tradition, then that's everything. And anything else beyond that is commentary. I do think, having been a parent now for 19 years almost, and never having been a single parent, and knowing many single parents, including in my family, that empirically, it's just undeniably harder to raise a child or do much as an adult without the regularity of partnership. It's just harder. It's a harder task. That's a statement that evinces no judgment. It's just true. It's harder to maintain a home without partnership. There's certain aspects of partnership that make maintaining a home more challenging because you have to take, other people's aesthetics and convictions into mind. But my experience, having raised now 3 children, or still raising 3 children with a partner, gives me without being pandering about it, gives me an extra level of awe for those who are doing that task without the regular partnership of another adult in the family. So I think Judaism would say, and the Torah would say, and Betham would say, we celebrate the parents in our midst who are doing jobs that never end, who are trying to teach a tradition against the grain of a modern society that does not necessarily make it easy to inculcate Jewish values, and that recognizes that all parents, whether single parents or in a married couple, are overworked and exhausted and under-thanked, and therefore deserves to be able to check into a community such as ours and feel embraced and feel blessed. So I know I danced around the question because there isn't a direct question. This isn't a direct answer to the tradition, but I guess it's my opportunity to say to all parents listening, whether you're in a marriage, a domestic partnership or not, we love you and revere you, and kol hakavod, all the power to you for doing this task of raising the next generation of Jews. Did you have another one, or do we want to move to Scott? I know Scott has a question. Should we hear from Scott? And thank you for that question.
Okay, mine's all over the place now. Listening to everybody talking, just really, really touching. But I just wanted to first thank you very much for your sermon last night. Your sermon had, to me, a lot of the beliefs that I have. And I think a lot of it is empathy towards other people, whether they're Black, Palestinian. I mean, people have a story behind them. And I know I'm not the most religious person, but as far as a Jew, I show empathy. And sometimes I feel people kind of push back when I try to express, saying, well, not everything's always black and white. People do have history. Because one person thinks one way doesn't mean the whole other part of the community thinks the same way. So with Israel, what are we doing as far as getting us involved in maybe even here in the United States with the Black Lives Matter movement and all that, helping people that need help and changing the views of others too, so we can have more peace and understand the rest of the country.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. There's a lot in what you just said, so I'm trying to figure out the best way to answer it. Here's the direction I'll take in answering really a 7-part question, and that's not a critique. That's just, you said a lot. I think an apt critique of what I said last night could be as follows. I mean, I stand behind what I said, but as I was thinking about the sermon and running it by colleagues, an apt critique is, well, if you're so curious about everyone else's position, then when do you start standing for something in particular? And when do you take stances? And when do you say, that I'm not willing to listen to? That is beyond the pale. That is unacceptable. That is hatred. That is rhetoric. That is propaganda. Because if you take the curiosity concept to the extreme, you're always so interested in what other people might have to teach you that you might forget that part of what it means to be a human being and a citizen is to develop an ethic and a stance of that which you believe to be right. So I didn't make it explicit in my sermon because I was hoping it was obvious, but maybe I shouldn't have left it so vague, is that I don't think that we apply that curiosity to, I'll use the obvious extreme to learn back all the ones in between the center point extreme to the Nazis, right? I don't think that sermon in 1941 would have been given saying, you know what? Sit down with a Nazi for 3 hours and ask them what makes them tick, and maybe you can understand what they have to teach to you. That's a ridiculous example on the fringe with hundreds of places in between. I do think that having an open mind and open heart does not mean that you are prevented or unburdened from having to come up with opinions on important things, whether it comes to issues of race in our society and the enormous way we have to go before we're achieving anything that could be called justice and equality. Whether you're talking about the Middle East, I went on that trip called Encounter to experience life in the Palestinian territories, as I said in the sermon, not to surrender my Zionism and not to convert in one fell swoop to believe that everything I once thought about the West Bank is now undermined, but to be able to have more chambers in my heart where I'm thinking about the real lived experiences of those who are the objects of what that rule looks like, and maybe allow me to have different kinds of conversations with people about the topic. So that's another roundabout answer to a question that has a lot of different components to it. And it's my way of trying to say, maybe to myself, in addition to saying all you, that there is a point at which beautiful curiosity has to yield to that which is right and that which is wrong. And some things are right and some things are wrong. And some policies are right and some policies are wrong. And some justice systems are right and some justice systems are wrong. And I do think that we both have to be actively curious and activists at the same time. But we're all going to choose different ways to be activists. And that's why I almost entirely refuse from the Bima, Temple Betham, to do what other colleagues do, and I don't judge them for it, which is different rabbis. And that is to instruct the Kahal from the Bima which things they should be activists for. It's not my way. It's not the way I understand Torah. I think you can wield Torah to be activists for all sorts of different things, including things that are diametrically opposed to one another. But I do think Torah should inspire us to be activists for causes that stem from our understanding of the Torah's highest values. How's that for a non-answer? Who is that? Hi, Debbie. It's
the political atmosphere in which we all live today, we have to find ways to cope and to deal with the stresses that come with it. And the thing that I am struggling with is actually how to be curious with family that holds such different views that seem to me antithetical to Jewish values. And it's really a struggle. In fact, I restrain myself from being curious because it's so painful.
Yes.
And that it could develop into such a worse situation, like silence is shalom habayit.
Right.
And I'm very much in favor of that.
Yeah. So we strain ourselves because we're afraid that if we go further, we will lose ourselves. We will lose our own dignity as we listen to something so abhorrent. And just by listening, we might be honoring, and we don't want to. There's a notion of acquiescence, of silence as acquiescence, and in Jewish law, shtika kahoda adame, that if you're quiet, you somehow acquiesce to what you're hearing, and you don't want to acquiesce to things that you think are abhorrent. By the way, there are some abhorrent applications of the very principle. There are rabbis in our neighborhood who will not walk into the Temple Beth Am sanctuary, because by walking into the sanctuary, they're giving sanction to the fact that conservative Judaism deserves to be counted as a Judaism, because they would say, "Shtika kathoda adame," if I'm quiet in the presence of walking into the sanctuary, you might think that I think this is a legitimate sanctuary. So there's some pretty abhorrent applications of that concept as well. In fact, I won't name names, but I once there was a wedding here at Temple Beth Am of two people, of a member and someone who was associated with another synagogue, and the rabbi of the other synagogue officiated, only on condition that the ceremony take place in any other room but the sanctuary. So the ceremony took place in Hirsch Hall, Hirsch Kopelov downstairs, because that way the rabbi could avoid the sin of walking into a synagogue and giving any kind of reference or honor to it. And that, by the way, is a principled position. I think it's a dastardly position, but it's principled, right? So when we live by our principles, we exclude people, and then maybe that is what's called for certain times, because we want to exclude people who don't fit into our category. And this rabbi has no problem saying they wants to exclude us. We don't exist. And that's where he draws the line. That's what Torah is telling him to do. I think it's disgusting, but what I don't think is disgusting is the idea of living by your principles and drawing lines. But we all want to be able to draw the lines where we think we should be drawing them, not where others. When it comes to listening to others who have opinions that we find so distasteful, when you're editing a sermon, you do a lot of cuts. There are a lot of things that didn't make it onto the final cut. So here's a story that didn't make the final cut of the sermon, but it was one of the last things to be cut. So I got it in. I learned this summer of two members of our community, two leaders whom I know and love and care about a lot, who couldn't be farther apart on the political spectrum, domestically, internationally, like it could not be farther apart. Like really chassidim for their causes, not just kind of, a passive voter in this way, but chassidim for their causes. Two people who I know to be decent, educated, well-read, smart, thoughtful, caring people. After kind of glancing blows with one another over the course of years, not physical blows, but just like, you jab in and out. I don't know which one decided first, but they decided they would sit down and just talk. And they thought the conversation would be about a half an hour. And they spent 4 hours just listening to the other, listening to this person that they knew, whom they assumed held, I used this phrase last night, ideas that were either moronic or monstrous or both, and try to hear the other person explain why this position might be still extremely disagreeable to you, but it's not moronic and it's not monstrous. And I think that their hearts softened in that encounter. And it was hard. Just conjure in your mind the version of the person of that to you and listen to them for 2 hours. And they walked away with a deeper understanding of what the other one stood for. And they don't think that the other one is a moron or a monster. They still think that the other one has positions that are not defensible, either according to American values or Jewish values or both. But there's an understanding. And they can sit next to each other at a boardroom table and have some honor for the other, even if they would never, ever hold most of those positions. I don't think that's unprincipled. I think it's living by a principle that's even more valuable, which is the curiosity of wanting to know what animates other people. It doesn't mean you have to digest and become them, right? Like that was what was so shocking to me about my dream. In my dream, I was becoming, for instance, you think about like the weirdness of your unconscious in a dream. In the dream, it was so overwhelming because I had become a man with black skin, which meant that I would have to live a life with what our society burdens that with. And it was overwhelming. But in real life, not in dreamscape, quote unquote, just having a conversation with someone who's on the exact opposite side of you are on Israeli politics or American politics does not force you to become them. And it's not giving their opinions sanction or honor by listening to them, and you might understand something that you didn't know about why they hold that opinion. So again, going back to Scott's question, at some point you have to be able to stand for something and make lines in the sand. But I think we have to be much more generous than we have been in general as a society. You have a follow-up, Debbie? Maybe. They weren't that way for me on Encounter. When I went to Encounter, the Palestinians I met were not on Encounter with me. I was on Encounter with them. I was listening. They were being visited by me for me to learn about them. They were not meeting me halfway. We're told on that trip, you are not there you're not supposed to ask a single question that you don't know the answer to. Sorry, only ask a question that you don't know the answer to. You don't ask gotcha questions. You don't ask questions that allow them to reveal your stance on things. You are there to find out and to be curious. Now, maybe in some alternate universe, there'll be a version of Encounter that sends Palestinian Arabs or Palestinian Americans or Muslim Americans into Jewish settlements in the West Bank and to just sit and learn their narratives. It doesn't exist yet. Maybe it will. But the purpose of that trip was not to be met halfway and to do the right and generous thing, even if the others in the dyad are not doing the right and generous thing. And by the way, I think that obtains in relationship, right? It obtains in the micro, right? In any friendship or any marriage or any relationship, there are many moments that require one of the two to say, I'm going to be the one that's going to yield. I'm going to listen. I'm going to be patient. And until one of them decides to do it completely, there's going to be blockage perpetually. I've told this story some time before, so you may have heard it, but I always come back to it in this kind of a moment. So I have a great relationship with my mother. It's not a perfect one, but I would say in public and private that I love my mother. My mother loves me. I'm very grateful for her. I have a great relationship with her. And at different times in one's life, that relationship gets, frayed, and often around big life cycle events. The week leading up to my wedding, we were in a bad place. I acknowledge it, and she would acknowledge it. I don't know what it was. I don't know. I was staying at home in Connecticut where I grew up, and his childhood patterns were awakened, and she was acting in a way that did not work well with me, and I was clearly acting in a way that did not work well with her. And we were getting very close to when I was going to get married. So I got married on a Thursday. That Monday morning, we had the Ufruf at my synagogue in Connecticut. And I was getting married out here in Los Angeles. So I was going to have the Ufruf and then get on a plane, fly to LA, and have a couple of days with some friends out here before the wedding. And my mother and I were oil and water that morning. The tension in the house that morning, I'm not overstating it. It was just waiting to boil over. And I had been looking forward to my Ufruf for many years. And I hated my Ufruf because there was so much anger and resentment. And I don't even know why. I couldn't even look at her. And from the Ufruf, she was going to drive me to Bradley Airport in Hartford, and I was going to fly to LA. And the next time I was going to see her, I was going to be walking down the aisle. And it's about an hour-long drive, and we sat in silence. And my mind's turning, and I'm assuming what her mind is turning, and I'm thinking, is this the way I'm going to go to my chuppah? And I was so convinced that she was acting so, immaturely and blah, 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 blah. I was so convinced that I was right. And with about 20 minutes left until we got to the airport, something stirred in me that made me realize that unless I went all the way to where she was, this is how we were going to feel under the chuppah. And about 20 minutes before we got to the airport, I started to speak, and I said, Ima, I'm nervous, and I'm anxious, and I probably haven't been acting appropriately, and I'm sorry. And she started to cry, and I started to cry. And for the last 19 minutes of the trip till we got to Bradley Airport, we found each other. But we wouldn't have found each other had I said, Ima, meet me halfway and compromise. Wouldn't have worked. Because we would have resisted that. In this case, it was me. And another time in my life might have been her. One person had to go to the other person's place and be vulnerable and be open and exposed. And something within me stirred me to do that at that time. It's not entirely analogous, but it's not completely not analogous, right? And I think sometimes it takes the full heart and maturity of someone to go completely into another person's lair and territory and lay down the arms and just listen and see if there could be something that is built from that, even if that person wouldn't be willing to do that on your behalf at that moment. Because relationships are dynamic and happen over decades. And in that moment, it was called upon me to do it. And, miniature payment for all of the times in my life where she met me exactly where I needed to be. Ronan, maybe one or two more questions because it's getting, well, not getting late, but it's getting long.
Change gears very sharply.
Okay.
So I was very moved in the meditation service by the idea of tying a nigun to the teaching of that rabbi. And I was thinking about it and I was like, this is not something that I feel is a very strong strain of teaching
Right.
in conservative Judaism and kind of a lot of what I've experienced in my life. The idea of teaching wisdom from the same sage as their own kind of nigun that they're famous for.
Yeah.
Can you just talk about that and what that means to you and what you think of it?
Yeah. First, thank you for recognizing that because that was intentional. A couple of answers come to mind, Ronan. And just for the context, Ronan is a composer, so he's asking this question not only but like so your artistic contribution to the world are combinations of notes and that speak to the soul. And so I understand why you'd be interested in why in the association of a rabbi's music with a rabbi's wisdom. One of the best classes I ever took was a one-off. Early on in my years as a rabbi, I was on like a rabbinic cabinet for the conservative yeshiva in Israel. Basically, we were committed to raising money and awareness about the conservative yeshiva, which at the time was a new institution. I think you studied there, and Rabbi Chorny studied there. I never studied there formally because it didn't exist when I was, and Rabbi Shapiro studied there. I don't know. Tigger studied there because it didn't exist back in my day. So when I went to yeshiva for a semester, I went to Yeshivat HaMiftar because it's an Orthodox yeshiva because the conservative yeshiva didn't exist. So I was committed to helping this institution get off the ground. So why am I telling you this? So on one of the experiences we had, like the rabbinic cabinet, if you raised a certain amount of money for the yeshiva, you got to go like one of these junkets where you get a pretty inexpensive trip to Israel and spend a couple of days studying at the yeshiva, learning with the students and the teachers, and then you could tell the story of the yeshiva when you went back home to fundraise. So I went, and I was there for a couple of days, and I happened to sit on a class that was being offered by Rabbi Dr. Pesach Schindler. Did you study with him? Okay, of blessed memory. Pesach Schindler, who was a scion of a Hasidic family, who became an academic and was the head. He was like the head of the Center for Conservative Judaism in Jerusalem. I studied with him actually when I was on Ativ as well, and he was teaching a class on Hasidic commentaries on the Haggadah. And this was a whole semester, and I just sat on one of them. I don't remember the name of the Hasidic sect, but he taught a commentary on the words V'hisha Amda Labotenu V'lanu, the promise that has stood for us in the generations, Shelo Achad Bilvad Amad Alinu L'Chalotenu, that it's not just one person that's come up to try to destroy us. Every generation they try to destroy us. V'hakadosh Baruch Hu Matzilenu Miadam, and the Holy One has saved us from their hands. He taught a commentary on that from some Hasidic sect. I don't know, Belz or Ger or Piazetz, I don't know what it was. And then at the end of it, after an hour-long class, he taught that Hasidic sect's nigun to that prayer. And it was amazing. It was gewaltic because your brain had been stimulated by the wisdom of that Hasidic tradition. And now your heart was moved by that which only music can do. And you could imagine them in their Beit Midrash in Ukraine or Hungary or Poland singing this nigun. And I loved it so much that I took from it both the general concept that when possible, teach the music associated with the tradition that you're studying, And particularly, our family now sings that Vehisha Amda at our Seder every single year. When I was younger, I intuited something about this, but it wasn't quite as, not in the musical realm. So I used to lead USY trips to Eastern Europe and Israel. And we noticed at the end of the summer that we were doing a very, very, very good job of teaching our kids about the worst aspects of the Shoah. They could tell us how many people died in Majdanek and what was the name of the Obersturmführer of Treblinka. But we asked them anything about Jewish life in Eastern Europe before the war, they knew nothing. Our fault. We were basically saying that Jewish life in Eastern Europe began in 1939 when they started to destroy us. But that for the hundreds of years before that, it was like a mirage. We were not doing a good enough job in talking about the beauty, the splendor of hundreds of years of Jewish existence. So we decided in future years that we would go to iconic locations associated with particular rabbis, the Maharal of Prague, where the Altanoi synagogue, and the Rabbi Moshe Isserles synagogue in Krakow, which I spoke about in one of my Divrei Torah today, and the Ger Hasidim in the town of Ger. And instead of just talking about how many Jews from this shtetl were rounded up and gassed, we taught traditions that were written by the rabbis who made those locations their home. So I taught something from the Maharal of Prague in the Maharal synagogue in Prague. And I taught the first few lines of the Ashkenazi Shulchan Aruch in the synagogue of the Rabbi Moshe Isserles in Krakow. And I taught something, and I taught wisdom from the Vilna Gaon at the Vilna Gaon's grave and at his synagogue. So it was attaching not the music of the rabbi, but if we're gonna read the epitaph of the rabbi for how he died and how his community died, let us at least get into something that was prevalent while he was alive. So I like the idea of this cross-fertilization of not just learning biographical facts about someone and not just learning about what they had to teach about the tradition, but also something about their spiritual life, which can be found through the music. I'm not a Jewish musicologist, so I know a lot about nigunim, but I don't know 3% of what one would need to know to make sure that one does what I did today with the Piazetzer more often, and a lot of it doesn't exist. Like we don't have the music of the Maharal of Prague, as far as I know, and we don't have the music of Rabbi Yosef Karo, who wrote the Shulchan Aruch. But to the extent that we do have it, we should use it. And I guess the last thing I will say is, we can do it now again in the modern tradition. Like, so when Rabbi Josh Warshawski gives a Dvar Torah on something on a high holiday Zoom, and then uses his tune that he composed to that liturgy, it's an incredible fusion. It's an incredible fusion, and I think we should be trying to do it more often. Thank you for that question. One more on Zoom, and then we'll call it a day. Who's on Zoom? Stuart. Unmute thine self, Stuart.
Hi.
Stuart.
Thank you for allowing me to ask a question. I'm going to ask a very broad question, which I'm sure you've thought about greatly over the years. And that is that there's been many articles in the last few years about the future of conservative Jewry, with the argument that with the fact that many Reform congregations are moving to the right with more ritual and more observance, that there's questions about the future of the conservative movement. And I would like you to comment about that.
We're out of time. I'm so sorry, Stuart. It's really okay. I'm trying to think if I should give the 3-minute, 10-minute, or 40-minute answer to that question. 3. I know. I'm kidding. I know, but I'm saying like there's a lot more to say. Okay, so I care about conservative Judaism, and I don't care about conservative Judaism, and I mean both of those statements. I care about the structure of the American conservative Jewish life. I care about our brand. I care about the synagogue, and the synagogue is organized according to conservative Jewish principles. I care about my job. I care about my team. I care about the perpetuation of this structure. And I don't, in the sense that what I care about is are serious Jews involved in an active engagement with both modernity and tradition. And I'm humble enough to know that there's not just one way of approaching that. And if I were to Rip Van Winkle myself and wake up in 100 years, and the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism would not exist, and the Rabbinical Assembly would not exist, and conservative synagogues did not exist, and the Masorti brand of Judaism did not exist in Israel, but new buds had burst through the ground and were living out the 22nd century's version of an engagement with contemporaneous mores and age-old traditions. Even if all of the brand names had changed, I would celebrate. I would mourn because I am nostalgically and professionally associated with some of these structures. But writ large, I don't think that the Kadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be her name, knows or cares about conservative Judaism. The extent to which we can anthropomorphize God, God cares about serious Jews engaging seriously, honestly, and passionately. So I know that's not really the question you asked. I think you wanted a more wonky answer as to what's going to happen as resources shrink, as communities join each other, and as some of the identities that have described conservative Judaism in America for 100 years begin to disappear. That does keep me up at night. I don't mind admitting it. I do wonder if in 3, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, what percentage of what we've taken for granted in this structure will exist. But on a religious, spiritual level, I care more about like the words in this book being interesting to the next 10 generation of Jews than I am about who published it. And if it means that even in my lifetime and in my career or beyond it, movements fuse and boundaries become more permeable, and therefore the structures that we've inherited convulse, leading to a lot of temporary discomfort. If it's in the name of Judaism continuing to reinvent itself while it remains in love with the Torah and the rabbinic tradition, I'd like to think I would applaud it, even if it meant something personally challenging in terms of my work and my career. Some of my rabbi friends and I like engage in gallows humor, and we say like all the structures have to do is last our careers. After that, let the chips fall where they may, right? Yeah, it's, the younger rabbis will take care of it. Which is our way of saying that we know that this is not an edifice like the Prudential Rock that's going to live forever. United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism, I'm just using an example, is not the book of Leviticus. It's not the Talmud. It's a temporary Polaroid picture of about 100 years of American Jewish yearning for Jews kind of like us. And it would not surprise me if there are more mergers. Rabbi Koneski and I have talked about it sometimes, with a twinkle and sometimes realistically. Like, why should we, communities who love each other, who care for each other, who daven differently and who do Jewish law differently, why should we be wasting so much Jewish money on preserving 2 campuses so close to each other, 2 sets of security staff, 2 executive directors, 2 electricity bills, 2 everythings? What if we just become a Jewish community? And in this room, we have this kind of davening, and in that room, that kind of davening. There's a Rabbi Koneski service, there's a Rabbi Kligfeld service, a Rabbi Shapiro service, Rabbi Chorny service, a Moratina Rabbanita Alyssa Thomas service, et cetera, et cetera. The reason why we haven't done that yet is because we're all somewhat committed to what we've inherited in these structures, but they're not from Sinai. And I won't cry that much if they change radically, if the reason they're changing radically is for Judaism to be more vibrant, not less. You want to say something? Rabbi Chorny will have the last word, as always.
No. I do not need the last word, but I will only take it a step further and say, what if it's not just conservative Judaism that's not set in stone, but also all of this Judaism that's not set in stone? Because I think that we've entered an era of enormous radical equity and accessibility. Because what was our friend's name who unmuted a little bit earlier from Florida? But who wanted to know the size of our congregation. But it's now possible to experience Judaism in the same way if you live in Portland, Oregon, as if you live on Park Avenue in New York City. And just as it was assumed that Temple Judaism was Judaism when Temple Judaism was Temple Judaism, and then synagogue Judaism became what it was, I think that this era that we're living in, like, I mean, just to go to the direct and not just the meta, like, look at what this Yom Kippur is. And I think that this is a year for us to ask questions about all assumptions that we've ever made about what makes Jewish practice work, what makes communities tick, and how we can be sharing resources and opening our doors and making practices accessible. And in those shifts, we may lose things, but I bet we're also going to wind up gaining a lot. Perspective, people, communities crossing over together. And this Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah have been very weird. They continue to be very weird, but also wonderfully full of possibilities too because of that.
I think we'll end here, at least partially because this space has to be reconstructed for Neila because we're having an entirely different setup. I want to say to all of you who are here under the tent and all of you who've been watching on Zoom and live stream, a very special experience to share Yom Kippur this year with all of you. Gemar Chatima Tova. Have a safe and easy remainder of your fast. We'll see you one way or the other for Neila.
Or Mincha.
All right. Or Hamala.
Right, but that's okay, whatever. But it's Mincha time. How does that what's the double up nigun again?
Very pretty behind.
Yeah, na na na